Okay, I think we are on the way, right? And so thank you everyone for joining this session on the Sri Lanka offshore wind roadmap that we have been working on with the government for about a year now. I am Jari Vayrynen. I lead the World Bank's energy program in Sri Lanka. I'm senior energy specialist based in Singapore. And I think our colleagues, should we introduce ourselves and then give the opening remarks to Chairman Sepala from the Sustainable Energy Authority of Sri Lanka. So we have the pleasure of having Chairman Sepala with us, indeed from the Sustainable Energy Authority. And Mark, Erik, and Rebecca, you want to quickly introduce yourselves?
Thanks, Jari. Mark Laborn, I'm the co-lead of the Offshore Wind Development Program at the World Bank. Erik?
Yes, hello, my name is Erik Mohr. I'm the head of section of the Wind and Energy Renewables department from COWI. Thank you. And lead on the Sri Lanka roadmap from COWI side.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Williams. I'm Global Head of Offshore Wind at GWEC, the Global Wind Energy Council.
Thank you. So after Mr. Sepala's opening remarks, I think Rebecca will say a few words, as well as then Erik make the presentation on the roadmap report that we have prepared. And, of course, we hope that there are many industry representatives. This session is being recorded and will be available afterwards. And any questions and comments would be also sent to us in writing after the session. So over to you, Chairman Sepala, to open the session.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Jari and Mr. Mark and staff from the World Bank. And actually, I'm really happy about this to connect with you with this session. So I am Ranjith Sepala, Chairman to Sri Lanka Sustainability Energy Authority. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for everybody. I know that participants are from different time zones, and the distinguished delegates and the ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for me to deliver the opening remarks for this webinar on offshore wind development roadmap in Sri Lanka. I am very glad to acknowledge the great support and guidance given by the World Bank Group on developing a roadmap on offshore wind and also for organizing this event for discussing details related to the particular study. I would like also to warmly welcome representatives from the technical community, the business sector, and other stakeholders group who are with us today. Today, our discussions are timelier than ever. The current economic crisis in Sri Lanka, which I would redefine as a power energy crisis, has opened our eyes to and reminded us of the importance of renewable energy applications in addressing the economic challenges and the related energy sector issues during the time of the broader crisis situation. As you all know, the government is stepping up effort to reach or achieve a 70% renewable energy share in electricity generation by 2030. To achieve this target, an additional 4,800 of megawatt of solar power and additional 3,500 megawatt of wind power will be required. These targets are really challenging, but a sound program will support to overcome the energy crisis. And also it will contribute toward strengthening the economy of the country as well. Renewable energy projects face challenges in acquiring lands and various social and environmental obstacles. We have been focusing on having a sound approach for obtaining land with blessing of all the relevant stakeholder institutions, and the necessary measures are being taken right at present. Nevertheless, any projects devoid of involving land issues will be most welcoming given the limited land resources we have in Sri Lanka. Further, we will need energy storage system and cross-border energy transmission to cater for the inherent problem of the variable nature of the particular energy resource, mainly due to the intermittence of the renewable energy that behavior, I mean inference or the behavior of the renewable energy. I hope that offshore wind development will open up a new avenue for regional cooperation, especially with the background a sound dialogue with the government of India on Indo-Sri Lanka cross-border grid interconnection. In terms of cost, even though the cost of offshore wind is little higher, hopefully it will reduce with the advancement and maturing of the technology. Despite the lucrative potential, there is a dire need for a regular framework and supportive supply chain system for the optimum harnessing of the potential. The Sri Lanka Sustainability Energy Authority has been aiming at putting solid foundation for offshore wind power development through sound policy and regulatory intervention and collaboration with other stakeholders, and wishes to be constantly in touch with World Bank Group. Yeah, of course, they already help for us, but I hope World Bank will support for the future work as well. Today, we are holding a discussion on the preliminary finding of World Bank Group's offshore wind roadmap study. I would request you valuable feedback on this finding. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Jari.
Thank you very much, Chairman Sepala. You touched upon many of the important points that I think will be also addressed by the next speakers and in the presentation, and that we have examined in the roadmap report. So with that, I would hand over immediately to Rebecca Williams. She's the head of offshore wind in GWEC. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Jari, for that introduction. And fantastic to be here to talk about the potential for offshore wind in Sri Lanka. I'm just going to give you a quick outline of the global situation with offshore wind and where I think that Sri Lanka fits into this. So since the beginning of this year, I think it's fair to say that we've seen a rapid acceleration in countries wanting to take forward offshore wind as part of their energy mix. And that's been driven by a number of factors. As the chairman already referred to, concern over the energy crisis is definitely driving more offshore wind deployment and more plans and targets around offshore wind as countries look to transition away from fossil fuels and to build more domestic provision to increase their energy security. So that's certainly a trend that we've been seeing over the last few months. I think also COP26 did provide a kind of catalyst from a climate perspective for countries to really reassess how they were producing their energy and look towards offshore wind as a way to catalyze climate mitigation as well. So we are seeing these two trends now of countries wanting to solve both the energy crisis and the climate crisis at the same time. If we take a brief look at the global picture and where we need to get to, it's been estimated by the IEA and IRENA that the world will need to deploy around 2,000 gigawatts of offshore wind to reach net zero ultimately. And so by 2030, that means we should have deployed around 380 gigawatts of offshore wind. So we've got a long way to go, I think it's fair to say, in terms of offshore wind deployment. But it's fantastic to see countries really now reaching forward to this ambition, putting more targets down, and looking at specifically how they can accelerate their progress towards offshore wind. So if we then turn to look briefly at the kind of regional perspective, I think the really exciting opportunity for Sri Lanka is to be part of Asia's energy transition. So we know that Sri Lanka has excellent technical potential for offshore wind, around 92 gigawatts, according to the World Bank Group. And I'm sure we'll hear more about how they can capitalize on that figure in the presentations to come. I think it's also really interesting to note what's happening in India, where we see rapid progress and acceleration towards offshore wind there as well. And actually, the Indian government has committed to a target of 30 gigawatts by 2030 of offshore wind, and also has recently outlined their plans for tender rounds for 2 key states in India. So in Asia, we are really seeing a kind of rapid speeding up of offshore wind deployment and acceleration. And Sri Lanka absolutely has the opportunity to be part of Asia's energy transition. I think we will be relatively brief. I'll be relatively brief in terms of my comments because I know there's a lot more to come, but hopefully that sets the scene nicely for where Sri Lanka fits in terms of the global picture. And I'll pass over to the next speaker now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Both you and Ranjith very accurately referred to the energy crisis currently happening around the world and impacting a lot of our World Bank Group client countries, especially hard. And in Sri Lanka, of course, for many years, it has been already realized that the high dependence on imported fuels is a risk, and now it has come to kind of come to bear harder than anyone hoped. And indeed, the World Bank Group, we are supporting the government and private sector also, both on renewables and energy efficiency as solutions to move away from the crisis and come out stronger and more sustainable, also globally speaking, and creating more opportunities for the economy as well as addressing the energy needs of the country. And obviously, like Chairman Sepala said, they are working very hard on land-based and floating solar. So we are supporting from the World Bank Group side some studies and hopefully projects going forward. And then, of course, to reach the very ambitious 70% target by 2030, thousands of new megawatts are needed. And offshore wind will probably be a very critical component of that. But of course, we all know around the table today or the seminar is that offshore wind takes quite a long lead time to develop projects and requires quite a bit of laying of the ground and assessments and studies. And this is something that we talk a lot about in the roadmap, but also hopefully can support the government with going forward. So with that, I think I will hand over to Erik from COWI, who has been our lead consultant for this study, to present some of the findings and recommendations. Over to you, Erik.
Thank you very much, Jari, on these opening words. Let me just prepare the screen to share. Is that visible for everyone? Super. Thank you very much for introduction, Honorable Chairman. World Bank Group has invited us together to work together on this roadmap over the past months, and we have been very glad to be able to support on the ramp up of Sri Lanka on the renewable offshore wind market. And we would like to present you now the initial findings, the key findings of this roadmap via this presentation. So what is the purpose of this study? The purpose is to independently evaluate the potential of the Sri Lankan offshore wind market and its capacity to support the growth of the regional offshore wind market in the area. As we all know, the new emerging markets have been growing rapidly worldwide, and you can see collaboration and also increase of markets that are neighboring countries. In this sense, this is why we need to take always the perspective, not only as a country of a singular, but also as a regional development. We would like to provide the Sri Lankan government with insights into the challenges and opportunities of developing the offshore wind sector and create a practical roadmap to help inform policy-making decisions. The idea is to produce a roadmap report that is relevant and informative to a wide range of stakeholders and interested persons in Sri Lanka's green transition. For this part, it's not only important to describe how the industry, the offshore wind industry, could develop as a total, but also identify a demonstration project inside the coastal regions of Sri Lanka that could serve as a basis and example for further development. The status that we are right now is that we have an offshore wind roadmap ready as a draft report that we have shared with the government, and we have identified suitable potential areas for Sri Lanka's first offshore wind project. the final iteration of the report and the cooperation feedback received from this consultation is to be issued then by end of 2022. But let's get more into detail of why offshore wind specifically. The government commitment to renewable energy and reducing dependence of imports that we have just heard is extremely crucial in order to select which renewable energies could be suited. If you have that as basis, next step is to decide out of the bigger portfolio how to drive that. And one key element is offshore wind, given the size that these projects can feed into. There's a huge national potential, and it can supply more energy than the country actually needs. And therefore, there is the opportunity to also produce other fuels like hydrogen or ammonia. The resource is close to coastal demand centers, and also there is high potential for a high output at lower variability, because compared to onshore wind projects, the offshore wind projects have less variability in terms of the variation of wind during day and night. Therefore, it is well suited to displace coal generation, and it avoids land constraints that we already heard can exist on island areas, and it can use extensive areas instead, which are available offshore. This new industry can also support the creation of skilled jobs and boost inward investment. And the regional supply and cooperation opportunity that you can see is also with a neighboring country, India, that also targets 30 gigawatts by 2030 and will develop significantly within the region of Tamil Nadu. At first instance, we would like to share already you the summary of these roadmap findings, and I will go into these into detail more later on. The opportunity is, as mentioned, that Sri Lanka has good offshore wind resource in areas that are suited for development of large-scale offshore wind. And there is this strong commitment from renewable energy from the Sri Lankan government, which can attract investors and will attract investors both financially and technology-wise, and therefore will contribute to a cleaner energy mix. The aim is to then be able to at least derive 7% of wind energy production, of which 1 gigawatt offshore wind could potentially be provided by 2030. There is a potential collaboration with the Indian offshore wind market and a possible interconnector. We will come into that into more detail later. There is a cost-competitive local labor available in Sri Lanka for long-term operation and maintenance, which is specifically relevant because the share of operation and maintenance work that needs to be provided is extremely large for offshore wind farm projects. The challenges that we foresee at this moment is that Sri Lanka currently does not have a sufficient supply chain to execute the construction of an offshore wind farm with significant proportion of local content. This is because the industry that is required for offshore wind is very specifically tailored to that industry and therefore not yet available in the country. The potential opportunity, though, that we see is that there is large investment for local content and education of local resources. And the regulatory framework is another challenge, where we don't see that the current support and implementation will be able to support large-scale industrial offshore wind on the long term. It doesn't hinder, though, the implementation of initial projects, but it does need to be set up in a way that it will be perfectly set up on a long term. We see the opportunity that modifying the regulatory framework will better support offshore wind and therefore reduce the risk of development process, help lower the cost of finance, and therefore, in the end, open the Sri Lankan market. Final point is that Sri Lanka's current grid infrastructure will require upgrades and expansions in order to support industrial scale offshore wind. There again is the opportunity to establish further economic investment and a collaboration with India through an interconnector between both countries. So, how did we approach this assignment? For this, we first took a look at the overall potential, the technical potential that the country has. World Bank has previously, via SMAP, already made a study of the technical potential available. And COWI did a deep dive into this in order to also consider further environmental and social restrictions in order to derive further locational potential. What we did is we started with mapping the wind resource around the whole of the country of Sri Lanka and identified that there are large portions of homogeneous good wind speeds along the northwestern border and the southeastern border of Sri Lanka. This we did by delimiting a minimum wind speed that would be needed, in this case 7 meters per second, and then see how far this reaches out along the country. In the next step, we identified the water depths that would be suitable for these sites and put a threshold of 15 meters to establish that there are areas suitable for fixed foundations and for floating wind, which is also nascent as an industry and can equally be implemented in Sri Lanka. When you combine the bathymetry and the usable wind speed areas, you result with what is then the technical potential for this industry. However, this is not yet the total result, as we then need to consider also the exclusion zones, may it be environmental, social, or further, as well as the restriction zones that may hinder the development of these areas. In the end, we derived three main areas, namely an area in the north, in the southeast, and in the west, which are suitable for offshore wind, as long as it is not delimited within an explicit exclusion zone. And these areas are then taken into account for in order to assess where we could develop a potential demonstration project. For a conservative approach, we identified all areas where there are also neither restriction zones nor exclusion zones. And therefore, this was visible within the area 1 and area 2, namely the north and the west, where only these areas already cover a total of 22 gigawatts of fixed potential, as well as 17 gigawatts of floating potential within usable wind speeds. For this, we made some assumptions on the generator, the industry generator capacity that could be used. And we need to remark that obviously technical, environmental, and social constraints could limit this further, but it still is far beyond what would be needed in order to feed the country's demand. These potential figures do not consider also the economic factors. And some projects in some areas may deem to be expensive, but again, there is enough area available around Sri Lanka for an offshore wind industry. What we have then done is we have then thought of what could be a demonstration project for the country. This is especially needed in order to drive forward the industry, in order to build the trust for developers that such a project can be executed within Sri Lankan waters with the shared knowledge of developers and the local industry. This we identified several sites depending on where the grid, the port infrastructure, and of course the wind resource and the relevant constraints are located. Even though the Gulf of Mannar is within a restriction zone, as you will have seen in the past picture, this deemed to be the ideal spot because it's not in an exclusion zone, but it is located explicitly beneficial in terms of a grid connection and relevant ports nearby. For this, we have identified high capacity factors up to 56%, as well as favorable wind speeds up to 9 meters per second. This is just an example of where such a demonstration could be. This is the idea of what we find feasible at this stage, but it also shows the potential of a LCOE around $70 to $8 per megawatt hour, based on a weighted average capital cost of 6%, assuming that this is reduced through financial mechanisms and proper risk mitigation measures. There are several options of how Sri Lanka could implement their first offshore wind projects, and they usually follow two different approaches. It can be government-led, or it can be developer-led. That means how the permitting is approached for these two sites and how often a competition is held. There is the option of holding only one competition, as well as an option of holding two separate competitions, as it is done in the United Kingdom. For this example, we have chosen two specific options. Both are equally feasible and have their advantages and disadvantages. The first one would be to approach this by a government studies with a single competition for the projects, the permit, the grid, and the offtake. The advantages is de-risking for the investment, the control of process and project location, whereas the disadvantages is the requirement of external support and increased government risk, where it's may hard to get it right overall. On the other hand, if it is a developer-led approach, the developer will lead the preliminary studies, but will then approach it with two competitions, one for the seabed lease and one for the offtake agreement. The advantages are that you can quickly appoint a developer and a site, whereas the developers will take over the development risk. The disadvantages is that you will need to design as a government two competitions, And also, there will be the need to have sufficient competition for the offtake. Overall, we see that this could take off as quickly as 2023 and then develop through the permitting and then the leasing and permitting support over the FID within 2027, 2028. A key issue in order to derive an industry is to establish a local supply chain. And there are challenges that we have identified within our offshore wind roadmap of how the supply chain can be born and developed and nurtured. We see there are both challenges and opportunities, and we have called these drivers for offshore wind in terms of the economic benefits. The challenges will include initiating and integrating the new industries into the Sri Lankan economic model, recruiting and educational local experts into the production, installation, and maintenance of large-scale offshore wind. Whereas the opportunity still is that therefore you can enhance education of local workforce and export technical know-how. The opportunities will include the potential for expanding the current industrial strengths of Sri Lanka and providing services to other emerging offshore markets, increasing investment in local economy, as well as investment into the physical upgrades of infrastructure and industrial plants to support the offshore wind industry, which may feed into future development. On the left side, you can see an example of how we made matrices of the different aspects that feed into the supply chain, whereas the track record as of now, of course, is still undeveloped, but it can extensively develop over time if collaboration and partnerships with international developers are looked for, in order to therefore create a huge opportunity for Sri Lankan government. Within this roadmap, we have identified two basic growth scenarios. One is a scenario for low growth, and one is a scenario for high growth. These are hypothetical scenarios of how offshore wind could develop in Sri Lanka. In this case, we have developed a cumulative approach whereby 2030, 0.5 gigawatts or 500 megawatts could be in place. By 2040, raising to 1 gigawatt, and by 2050 to 2 gigawatts. This can be a combination of bottom fixed and floating offshore wind. On the second part, we could approach this in a high growth scenario where massive involvement is done for offshore wind, both from the government, the stakeholders, and the industry, and therefore grow from 1 gigawatt by 2030 to 2.5 gigawatts 2040, and up to 4 gigawatts by 2050, again in a combination of bottom fixed and floating wind. The LCOE for low and high growth is expected to be similar due to the capacity factor limitations of the wind resource, especially during first phases of offshore wind implementation. But it will begin to drop on the high growth scenario beyond 2030 as the industry becomes established. Key considerations, again, for offshore wind growth will be the grid integration, the energy balance, and potential for an interconnection with India in order to allow further sale of energy. We expect that cost reduction in terms of 10 to 15% may be able when compared to 2023. Here are some key figures also from the report. We have identified total investment over the roadmap period reaching up to $6 billion. The accumulated employment effects from offshore wind are also massive, where we can see from low growth scenarios up to 24,000 full-time employees, and a high growth scenario up to 57,000 employees for 1 gigawatt. This again may be a lower scale in terms of other countries, but for Sri Lanka as a country, it is definitely a huge step forward. On the breakdown of the investment, we will see a combination of direct investment and indirect investment for the total impact of the gross value added, which will also strongly benefit the industry of Sri Lanka. Overall, we can say that engaging in offshore wind industry for Sri Lanka on the long term will play off, not only on local content in terms of local employment, but also in the investment into the country. We also analyzed the regulatory and policy frameworks, both those that are available and those that would need to be implemented. Right now, Sri Lanka already has an onshore wind industry and has a regulatory framework set up for onshore wind. But it must be noted that offshore wind does need some further requirements that are very different from the scales and the development that we see for onshore wind. Therefore, a clear and robust regulatory framework for offshore wind will greatly de-risk the potential for investment and directly influence the LCOE by reducing the barriers of financial investment and cost capital. Currently, no specific regulatory framework for offshore wind farms is in place in Sri Lanka. And though some legal references are already made, this is explicitly needed for offshore wind. The current regulatory framework could support the early implementation of offshore wind energy, and by this specifically, for example, a demonstration project. But the sustainable development of further offshore wind would require an offshore wind farm regulatory reform. The activities that we could see here in order to reduce the risk in the regulatory framework include to streamline the regulatory framework in permitting, such as improving the current coordinating role of central authorities by facilitating project developers in the permitting process and their applications to different authorities. Regulatory uncertainties relate to the completeness of site preparation and the comprehensive outcome count of environmental and social impact assessments. Specific offshore wind farm related legal requirements for site preparation and for the SIA could assist in de-risking by eliminating the uncertainty perceived by stakeholders. The most important that we see right now also is based on the current procurement regime for current large-scale offshore wind projects based on private financing. A significant risk is allocated to private developers in undertaking studies, investigations, and the SIA. So de-risking the finance investment for developers in this case is key. For this webinar, I would like you to have 6 takeaways on our offshore wind roadmap, which you will be able to read much more into detail later on. The first one is offshore wind in Sri Lanka has significant potential in areas that are reasonably well suited for development. The supply and demand for electricity, and specifically for offshore wind energy, will need to be carefully managed and planned, especially the grid limitations. Offshore wind will provide a gateway for investment and job creation in Sri Lanka, but also require commitment and early investment internally to pave the way for later long-term growth. This is especially relevant in establishing a stable supply chain. The next is that short-term implementation of offshore wind could be possible within the current regulatory framework, but on the long term, the regulatory framework should be adopted to support lower cost, large-scale offshore wind production. Offshore wind will need to be affordable. This may result in needing to collaborate with neighboring markets, also looking to invest in offshore wind. This can especially be possible, for example, with India. A demonstration project has been identified at this stage that fulfills the basic requirements and constraints to move Sri Lanka's offshore wind future forward. In this case, we see the demonstration project as the next step in order to provide further drive for offshore wind industry in Sri Lanka. Some words on the consultation as will move forward. We will make the presentation slides available through SMAP's page. We invite you to provide written feedback through the emails attached. And we will be able to provide short meetings in order to discuss with World Bank and ourselves on this roadmap. Then both COWI and World Bank will be present on Wind Energy Hamburg. Feel free to join. And please respond to any of the points below of interest in order to address your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Erik, for a very interesting presentation and giving a sense of the opportunity for this market and for business and for developers to come to this market, especially a regional market with India can be developed, creating a much bigger opportunity or hub for this sector, as well as, of course, some of the challenges that need to be addressed and worked on in order to really go to the scale and take advantage of the opportunity at full scale. I just wanted to add on the context that we hope that Sri Lankan delegates, we are trying to get their visas sorted out, but they will join us in the European study tour that Erik mentioned and the seminar there, and Chairman Sepala himself will be joining us, as well as we hope even the Power Secretary may be able to join us, as well as Chairman of CEB, Civil Electricity Board, and DG or Director General from the Petroleum Development Authority. We have very good dialogue with the Petroleum Development Authority as well, As you of course know, as industry experts, there are lots of synergies with the offshore gas and oil industry, and synergies and potentials for collaboration, for example, in surveying the seabed and so forth. So there's already quite a good collaboration between the different segments of the government, and clear commitment and drive to move this forward. Maybe we give Mark an opportunity to say a few words before we ask if Mr. Sepala would like to say anything as concluding remarks. But over to you, Mark. You are the lead for the World Bank's global program and have that global perspective as well as working on India and Sri Lanka in this region. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Jari. I think covered an awful lot of ground and covered most of the points I actually wanted to raise already, but I'll perhaps just reiterate a couple. I mean, Erik's produced a very good, succinct presentation covering a lot of material that we've been working on over the last year or so. For those of you who have seen our other roadmaps that we've produced for a few other countries, you know, there's a large body of work here, a lot of pages to go through. We're not publishing all of that material right now for consultation. We're publishing the excerpt from that. And there are a few additional slides that Erik hasn't had time to present today that will be included as part of that presentation that will be uploaded on our website. I'm hoping later today, but please check back there tomorrow at the latest. You'll have the opportunity to go through those slides. And as Erik mentioned, please do submit your written feedback to us. If you would like to spend a bit more time discussing this market with us, please get in touch. We've got some availability over the next couple of weeks. But as we mentioned, we're starting this offshore wind study tour to Europe next week. And actually 2 weeks today, we will all be at Wind Energy Hamburg. There will be opportunities to network with us and the Sri Lankan delegation. You will hear from, hopefully, the Sri Lankan delegation as part of the Global Markets Theatre. You'll have an update from them about their efforts in Sri Lanka. If you're at Wind Energy Hamburg, please get in touch. Please come and see us. We'll be happy to make some introductions and continue our conversation. So the other thing I'd say is that this presentation is being recorded. It will be on YouTube afterwards. We'll share the links probably on LinkedIn and social media, and happy to share that if anyone would like it. And please do share that with colleagues that might be interested. I think that's all from me. So I'll hand over to Mr. Sepala to see if you have any final closing words.
Thank you very much. I think you gave a big picture of the offshore wind development. I think we have to go further, hopefully, right? So we have to collect more information and ground information and the other relevant, the information for the designing of the turbine and other planning of the energy and how much we can get it and when and where. So those are the very important things. And further, we already received some, the EOI expression of interest for the, especially in the Gulf region and the southern part of the country. So I think we have a lot of opportunity for that one, but we have a question how we go forward with those EOI. So I think we need some advice from you and expertise in that area. So I have no idea to the push for the further, but if we can bring forward with the low cost arrangement, so that is what we need. Since I believe that we can get the higher power plant factor in the offshore wind than the onshore wind. So I hope we can connect the local entrepreneurs and start some, the manufacturing process within the country. So then it will give added advantages to the country as well and the boom of the economy in the future. So Anyway, thank you very much for arranging this webinar. I hope, as you mentioned, we can further discuss in the tour you arrange in the next week time. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Sepala, and everyone who participated in the panel. I think the World Bank Group stands ready to provide further support to figure out those next steps towards a demonstration or a first project, and much further from there. So thank you, everyone, and we hope to see many of you indeed in the study tour and seminar or conference in Europe. And please, if you are there, look us up, and especially look up the Sri Lankan delegation and discuss with them and provide your views and advice also, because it's not only obviously the World Bank Group that should be providing views and advice, but hear from the practitioners who have done it and have gone out to the sea and built these things. They really understand this obviously better than anyone, and how to construct and develop or design a tender process or process for these projects that can really attract the private sector participation. That will be critical. With that, I would conclude this webinar or consultation, and hope that you will provide a lot of feedback and comments and questions also after this event. With that, from my side, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.